Hello everyone, in today's After Effects tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at how to create a simple extension. Now, an extension is basically a combination of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, as well as scripting or JavaScript extended. Today we're going to be taking a look at creating this color palette manager, which simply works like this. And if you want to check out the guy who made that video's channel, go ahead and go to the link in the description down below. He makes a lot of really cool motion graphics videos, and he's French. So like the video showed, the basic way this works is we have our footage here. We click on the add button. It then analyzes our footage. And then once it's finished analyzing our footage, it'll pop the color scheme it finds or color palette into the extension over here. From there, we can actually go back into one of these compositions, and we can go up and click on the comp button on any of these, and it's going to add these colors into the composition. Now, the basic difference, just for those of you who don't know, between a script and an extension is basically HTML that controls scripts, and a script is something that just controls After Effects. So with this, we have both the advantage of having custom UIs based on HTML5 and CSS3, as well as the functionality of ExtendScript. So as a preface, if you're not familiar at all with coding whatsoever, this tutorial might be a little bit too advanced because we're not going to be going line by line through the code. We're going to be coding a little bit and explaining a lot more. So basically, inside of our folder for our extension, we're going to have our index.html file, which is going to be our main UI. We'll have a JSX folder with our After Effects script, another JS folder with our main JavaScript functionality, as well as a Scs Interface library, which is going to link between After Effects scripts as well as the interface. Then we have a CSXS folder with our manifest file. This is an XML file that's going to contain basically our script's data. If you've ever programmed for Android or iPhone, it's going to be a lot similar to that when we're defining our basically ID for our extension. Then we have our CSS folder, which is just our styles, and an assets folder with our logo. One thing to note is inside of our JavaScript and libs folder, our Scs Interface.js version is very important. In the description, you'll find a link to this GitHub repo where we have different versions of CEP. And again, CEP is just the bridge basically between an After Effects script and all the HTML code that we have. So you'll want to download a different version depending on the compatibility you want with different versions of After Effects. If you get version 4, which is the most early version, it's going to work with everything from After Effects CC 2014 and above. And if you get version 8, it's going to work with CC 2018 and above. So I'd recommend starting off with version 4.x and getting that to get started. And once you download this whole repo, you can just go into the CEP version folder of your choice, copy and paste the Scs Interface.js file into your JS libs folder, and ensure that your version is the correct one. And there is one more thing we need to go over before we can start getting into this, and that is setting up our player debug mode on Mac and PC. This is basically going to allow us to run third-party extensions without having any issues inside of After Effects. If you don't do this, you're unlikely to see your script show up in the window extensions area. So on Windows, what you're going to want to do is launch regedit, and this is going to allow us to edit our registries. And then we're going to want to go to HKey current user. We'll go into software, Adobe, and then you can see we have CSXS 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. All of these are going to be the versions of CSXS, and any of the ones that you want to be using, we'll need to make sure we have a property called player debug mode, and the data needs to be set to 1. So basically just right click on it, click on modify, and ensure that the value data says 1. Click on OK, and make sure all that's saved. And just to be safe, I'd recommend going through each version from 4 to 9 or whatever versions you may have and making sure all of them are debugged. And then over on a Mac to do this, you simply need to run terminal and then type in defaults write com.adobe.csxs.your version number and then player debug mode 1. And again, you'll want to do this for each version of CSXS or our CS interface that you're going to be using for After Effects extensions. Alright, so now that we've gone over the basics of how this is all functioning, we can go ahead and get started. I should mention, to get to your extensions folders by default, on Windows you'll want to go to your app data, so type in %app data and then % again. Then we'll go into Adobe, CEP, and extensions. On a Mac, you'll want to go to Library, Application Support, Adobe, CEP, and extensions. So let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to do is just create a new folder. I'm going to call this our Color Palette 2. And like I said, we're not going to be writing everything line by line here. So I'm going to start off by taking all of our files inside of our Color Palette Manager, copying them, and I'm going to paste them inside of our Color Palette 2 panel. Now if I were to try and launch this, it's actually not going to change anything. The first thing we need to do is open up our manifest file, which is sort of the first thing that gets initialized when we call this extension. So to start off, as you can see, we have our manifest file here. It contains basically a list of XML properties that are going to correlate and tell the extension what is going on. So let's go ahead and just go over the basics here. We start off with our extension manifest. This is going to include the version number, which is going to be the version of our CSXS. We have our extension bundle ID, which is currently set to COM Color Palette. I'm actually going to change this to Palette 2. The reason for doing so is we need to change our bundle ID as well as our name to make sure that After Effects can distinguish this tutorial script from our original Color Palette Manager. So I'm just going to change that to comcolor.palette2. We got our extension bundle version, which is just the current version of our extension. The extension bundle name, which is the name of our bundle here, I'll just call it 2 again. And then a link to the XML shim. And then again down here under extension list, I'm going to change our extension ID, change palette to palette 2. The host list and host name are very important as well. This is going to define which Adobe programs this is going to run in and which version of those programs it's going to run in. So basically, this is going to run in After Effects version 13 and above. If you wanted to specify certain versions, you can simply put in brackets and then basically input an array here. So if we wanted version 13 to 14, we could just do that. But if you want one version and above, you simply just put in the one string. Then under required runtimes, we have our CSXS and version 4 again, just to make sure that everything gets linked properly. We have another instance of our extension ID, so I'm going to change that to palette 2. And then under resources, we have our main path, which is going to reference the first thing it loads up, which is our index.html file. And because our manifest XML file is in a CSXS folder, we need to go to the root folder and then our index file. And then we're also going to reference our script path for our After Effects script that we're going to be using. And inside of our After Effects script, we're going to have a bunch of functions to do everything for us. Then we have the UI defined here. It's a panel type UI called Color Palette Manager 2. And then we have the height, width, min height, mid width, and max height and max width. If you set all of these to the same value, nothing in your UI will be able to scale up or down. So I like to do this by default, but if you do have a dynamic UI, you can go ahead and change the values for your min and max size. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and save this manifest.xml file. I'm going to go ahead and close this Color Palette Manager and restart After Effects. And once it loads up for us, we'll go up to Window, Extensions, And as you can see, we now have Color Palette Manager and Color Palette Manager 2. Now this is literally a basic carbon copy of the previous script. So what I'm going to do is reduce our HTML, JavaScript, JSX, and CSS files just a little bit, and then we're going to go over some basic coding inside of there that should help you get started in making your own extensions. So what I'm going to do is go back into my Color Palette 2 folder and load up all of my files here in my text editor or coder of choice, which is Sublime. So load my index.html, I'll load up my AfterEffects.jsx file, my main.js file, and my styles.css file. So one thing I should mention is anytime you make some major change to your manifest.xml file, it's highly recommended that you restart After Effects. Alright, so I've got our bare bones HTML file here, and this doesn't even include our logo, so I'm just going to close the extension here. So this is just a basic HTML file here. At the top we're referencing our styles that we're using, which we have a styles.css with custom styles, as well as one called Topcoat Desktop Dark, which I use for custom UI elements like buttons. I'm going to go ahead and change the title here to Color Palette Manager 2. And we also start off this HTML file with a script that basically won't allow anyone to right click on our extension, because basically if they right click on our extension, they'll be able to do things like copy and paste, and I don't want them to do that, so I just put in this code here. Inside of our body, we're going to have 3 sections. The main div here is going to be for our logo and that area. The next one is going to be for all of our color palettes, and the last one is going to contain our button as well as any text that we want to show the user or ourselves to debug. So to start off, we have our main div here, and make sure you check out the GitHub repo below to get all of this code. We're going to start off by making a div inside of here, and we'll just call it logo. And I'll go ahead and end that. And inside of this div, we're just going to have the image for our logo here, which again, if we remember, is inside of our assets folder. So what we'll do is we'll say an image tag with the ID, we'll call it logo image. And for the source, we're just going to say our assets folder and the file called logo.jpg. And then I'm also going to set up a quick style just to set the size up here. So we'll say style equals, for the width we'll say 480 pixels, and for the height let's go with 120 pixels. And then of course we'll need to close our tag there. Now let's go ahead and just run this to make sure that it's working alright. I'll make sure all of my files here are saved and click on run. And as you can see, we now just have our logo as well as an empty UI below it. So inside of our span class with a body, this is where we're going to put in all of our palettes. We're not going to be generating these right off the bat. We're going to be using JavaScript to do so. But we need to set up a quick div here just to put them all inside of. So inside of our span, I'll create a div with the ID called palettes. And again, I like to do some inline styles here. Just make the width 490 pixels and the height 400 pixels. And then of course end that div. So everything we put within this palettes div here is going to be our actual palettes, and as well as our button to add it to the composition. And then within our last div here, you can see looks like I actually forgot to end or start the span. So we're actually going to be creating the starting span for this. So we'll say span, and we'll give it a class called buttons. I'll set its style to be basically the same as these, so I'll just copy and paste this. The width is good. For the height, I'm just going to make it 45 pixels and close that. Inside of our button span class, I'm going to add a button. This is going to be the main button to run everything. We're going to give this an ID called the add button. And because I'm using a custom CSS library, the Topcoat Desktop Dark, I'm going to set this class to a Topcoat button large. and that's just going to be a custom UI element based on that CSS. And then we'll end this button, and for the inner HTML we're just going to use a plus button. One more thing we're going to add to the right of this is a span with the ID called help tip, and we'll end that. And basically what this is going to be is things that we can display to the user or ourselves to see if we're getting any errors with our JavaScript, etc. So we'll just say this will include debug info for everyone. Alright, so now if we go ahead and save this and relaunch it, you can see we now have our main color palette logo. We have our main area here with a scroll bar that's currently not in use, as well as our button and some debug info. Alright, so to finish off this, we need to go ahead and include our JS files. The first one, we're going to use a script, and the source for this script, let's go ahead and check here. It's going to be inside of our JS libs folder. So for the source, we'll say js-libs, and it's called Scs Interface.js. And we'll close that tag here. And the second one is just in the directory above in the JS folder itself. And the source for that is just going to be our JS folder and main.js. And this is going to be important that we always reference at least our CS interface. We may have just our JavaScript in our HTML file. However, we need to make sure that we have our CS interface CEP library to communicate with the different languages. Alright, so now let's move on to our main.js file. I've gone ahead and reduced it a little bit. I'm going to be going over all of the code in a minute, but I want to start off by teaching you guys something. And we're going to be adding an event listener as well as using a custom method inside of the CEP library to run some code inside of our JSX file. So we start off here with a main function. We've set up some variables, one called palette counter, which is just going to count how many color palettes we create. And then we have something called a CS interface. Now a CS interface object is basically what I've been talking about with all this CEP and communicating between languages. We can call this later on, which we're about to code, to basically evaluate any function within our After Effects.js file. So if we wanted to call this main.js, main function, we could say something like evaluate the script called After Effects and then run this main function. And we can also use the CS Interface.js library to pass our arguments into these functions. So after that, we basically have a simple add event listener for our logo. We've just added an on-click listener, and every time we click on it, it's going to use our CS interface to open a link. So if I click on this, it's supposed to take me to basically my VideoHive portfolio. It's not going to work right now because we're missing a big chunk of code and we need to code that right now. So down below our event listener to go to our website, we have a bunch of code that gets initialized by something. And the way we want to initialize all of this code, which is basically generating our color palette, is by clicking on this add button here. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript, the way we can get elements is by using get element by ID, get elements by class, or get them by other properties. So I'm going to say document.getElementById, and what this basically means is inside of our entire HTML document, we want to search for anything with the ID name that we're about to input. So if we look for our button, our button's name or our button's ID is add button. So I'll copy that, and inside of document.getElementById, I'm going to, inside of a string, say add button. And I should probably use single quotes to remain consistent here. And after we have gotten our add button, what we need to do is add an event listener. And I just need the opening bracket here because I've already got all the closing ones down below. And for our add event listener, we're going to pass through a couple of arguments. The first one is the event. So for this, we're just going to say click. And then we'll also say function and have this code here. So anytime we click on our add button, we want to do this function here, which includes all of this code. I'm going to set up some initialization things. So like I said, we have this palette counter up here to count how many times we've created a color palette. And I said anytime we click on the add button, we need to increase it. So since we've now clicked on our add button, we need to say palette counter plus plus to increment it up by 1. And then because I don't want to have to worry about this CS Interface object being global, I'm going to create another CS interface in here. So I'll say var add interface is equal to a new CS interface. And I'm just again doing this to make sure that we don't have any conflict with this previous CS interface. That way we have proper scope here. Below that, I'm going to set our color values up here back to undefined again. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to be running JavaScript Extended, JavaScript HTML, and CSS. Because these programs don't run in a sequential order, they're all running simultaneously and are asynchronous. We need to make sure that we have variables set to undefined until we need to define them, until the absolute last moment. I know it's a little bit complicated, but basically if we didn't set this color values to undefined right here, it would give us an error. So now down below this, we're finally going to get to use our library custom method. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to grab our first interface here, which is add interface, which is our CS interface. And we're going to say .eval script, and this is going to be a function here. So I'll open parentheses, and again we have all of the ending code down below, so I only need an opening paren. And now inside of a single quote string for the first argument, we're going to call our first JS function. We're going to call the JSX function that we want to run. So like I said before, we want to start off by running our main function here. So what I'm going to do inside of our quotes here is say main with our parentheses. And just like that, it's going to run, anytime we click on the add button, it's going to run our main code here. And then also we're going to say for the second argument, a function with the variable res going through it and a beginning parentheses as well. And underneath here, we're going to set up our color values finally, which remember we just set to undefined, but now we want to set this equal to json.parse, and we're going to be parsing this res variable that we just arbitrarily passed through this function here. So basically color values is going to be equal to whatever returns from this main function here. And if we go into our main function in the JavaScript file, we're going to be returning colors, which is an array of colors that we need our palette to be equal to. So now once we run the main script evaluation, the color values is going to be set to whatever gets returned from the function that we called or main here. And then I have a couple of variables set up here that I deleted. One called thisSplit, which is an array. One called allHex, which is also an array. One called a div, and one called a line break. Alright, so that's the basic coding that I wanted to teach you guys for this JavaScript file here. If we look down below, let's go over this code here. So basically we're going to say if our color values is not false, if we have some values in that array that we're getting back, then we want to do all of this code. And what is this code doing? Well, the first thing we're doing is we're creating a div element called a palette. Now this palette is going to be containing all 5 of our colors as well as our comp button to add it to the composition. So we're just going to set up some styles here by saying palette.style.width and height is equal to these pixels. We're going to set the ID for the palette to be palette plus the palette counter. So the first time we click on the button, it's going to be palette 1, then palette 2, then palette 3. We're going to set the palette class to palette holder because it's going to be holding everything. And then we're going to get the palettes div. Now if you remember, we have this main palettes div, and I said every palette is going to go inside of here in this area right here. So what we want to do is grab this element. So we'll say document.getElementById palettes, and we're going to append the child called palette that we just created right here. Now append child basically means you grab an element and you basically make a child of it, which means that it's below it. So this image tag right here with our logo image is a child of this div called logo, and this div is a parent to this child. So after we've added that, what we're going to do is go through a for loop for the number of color values we have. Now the number of color values we'll have is always going to be 5. Because we have 5 colors in each palette, we're going to go through this loop 5 times, starting at 0 and going up till 4. And remember, arrays in programming start at index 0 and go up. So we're starting at 0 and then going up till we get to the length. Then we're going to basically parse all of the information. We're going to take all of the information from our colors array, and we're going to get the RGB values from it. Then we're going to create a div element to separate things. So then we're going to create a div element for each of our colors here. So we're going to say div equals create element, and we're going to be making a div, and that's going to be a nice 80 by 80 square. Then for the background color, we're going to use the values that we just pushed into this all hex array, and we're going to set that equal to that. And then we're going to set our attribute for these little square boxes of color to be color panel. And then finally, we're going to reference our palette counter and append our square of color. Then after we've created 5 colors for our current palette, we're going to create a delete button. So we'll say document.createElement button. We're going to set up the width and height to be a square 60 by 60. We'll set the margins to be all 10 pixels all around. We're going to have the inner HTML or the text of the button to say comp. I'm going to set the attribute to be a custom class called topcodeButton, which again is referencing our CSS. We're going to set the ID to be our palette counter, and then an attribute for onClick called addToComp. Now when we set an onClick attribute, whenever we click on it, it's going to run this function called addToComp, which we'll go over in just a second. Finally, we're going to get our palette counter, our current one, and we're going to add the delete button to it. And then we're just going to add a line break and add that to our document. That way we can have multiple color palettes and they're not going to be all unorganized. So then of course make sure you close out all of your parentheses and brackets. It's a bit messy sometimes, especially when you're using a val script, but it should make a fair bit of sense. So like I said, when we on-click our delete button, which really isn't a delete button I should say, this is our add to comp button. Originally it was going to be a delete button, but it ended up just being an add button. It's going to run our add to comp function and pass through this, which is going to reference our button itself. And what we're going to do inside of this function is say this palette is equal to our delete button or our add to comp button, its parent element, which is going to reference the palette we created for this individual color scheme. And then we're going to say these colors is equal to all of our square blocks of color inside of here. As you can see, we're going to say this palette dot get element by class name and all of our color panels, which again are these square colored panels. Then we're going to create another CS interface inside of here just to make sure we have proper scope. And this time we're going to evaluate our script, and we're going to go into our After Effects script file and go to the function called generatePalette. And as you can see, this is basically going to generate our palette inside of After Effects and pre-compose it and add it to a composition. So as you can see, we have our generatePalette function, and then we're also passing through multiple arguments here. We're going to be passing through our color 1, color 2, all the way up to our color 5 to make sure that we can have all of these colors inside of our script. We also have a couple of simple functions to convert Rgb to hex, and these are pretty straightforward. Alright, so I know that's been a lot of explanation and not a lot of coding, but this kind of thing does take a while. It ends up being hundreds of lines of code between the different languages. I'm going to assume that most of you guys understand basic CSS, where you call either a tag, an ID, or a class, and then you can set values like the width, height, font size, whether it transitions, the opacity, and much more. So this is just basic CSS here, just making sure the padding and sizes are all good. One more thing I want to go over briefly here is our actual After Effects scripting code. If you check out my YouTube channel or check in the description, there should be a link to a color palette scheme. There should be a link to a color palette generator or color scheme generator. And this is a script that I've created before for this channel. And what I've basically done is I've organized the code a lot more, created more functions so that you can better tell what's going on, and I've basically used all of that code previously and made it into an extension. And the reason I've done that is it's incredibly useful to make things into extensions, because dockable scripts, although very useful, they have a lot of limitations in terms of UI design and animation, and they have a lot of problems throughout different versions of After Effects. So using HTML and CSS rather than just built-in scripting UI options can make things a lot easier and more customizable for you. So the basic way any of this works is just like any other script. This is all recycled code. We're going to go through the main function and then basically run through a bunch of other stuff here. We're going to set up our comp, and inside of our setup we're going to go into analyze pixels, and we're going to analyze pixels and end up doing things like calculating colors, cleaning up some text, and just some other mathematical algorithms to get colors. So again, most of this is recycled code, and if you need to look at how this all functions, I've got a tutorial already created for how all of this works, and it comes with a free script as well. So now that we've gone ahead and coded all of this, I'm going to save all my files, go back into After Effects, and let's test it out. So I'll launch my Color Palette Manager 2, and I'll dock this in the side here. Alright, so I've got a couple of images here I'm just going to bring into a new composition. So the first one, I'm going to go ahead and select my comp, make sure I have my layer here, and click on Add. As you can see, we have nice checks here. It says please only select one layer, so we need to make sure we have a layer selected. Click on plus. And now as you can see, it kind of snapped back into here. This is a problem I'm not sure how to fix yet. If you are aware of how, I'd appreciate a comment letting me know why it would snap back like this. As you can see, it's gone through and created our color palette for this image. Let's go ahead and do this one as well. Click on plus. And the time this takes will depend on the size of your video. 1080p usually takes roughly 10 seconds, but anything larger can take a lot longer. So now we've successfully created a couple of color schemes here. What I can now do is click on one of my comps and click on the comp button to add it. And I can actually go in and add a bunch of these if I wanted to. Just keep going in and adding more and more. And this is just a great way if you're looking to do some design and need to know what colors match the scene. This will really help you out. So 2 more notes I want to make before we close out this tutorial. I didn't do much with our debug help tip here. So what you could do is, say you had some code that wasn't working. Say you went into your add button here and something wasn't working at the beginning. What we can do is say document.getElementById, and let's go ahead and check again what we called the ID for this. It's called a help tip. So we'll say help tip, and we're going to set the inner HTML, which is basically referencing the text, equal to you are now clicking on the add button. And now if I go ahead and run this, it currently says this will include debug info for everyone. And I'll run this. And now it says you are now clicking on the add button. So if you don't want to use alerts, which you can in both JavaScript and JavaScript extended, what you can do is have a text element that you can update, and you can display values in here and check if they're undefined or null and find out what problems you're having. And one cool thing about this script is that we can actually scroll down here if we add more color palettes, which allows us to have a nice concise UI with lots of color palettes. And one more thing you might have noticed is if we relaunch our palette here, you can see it doesn't maintain the same colors at all. They all disappear. What you could do is implement a function that basically writes the color information to a file, and then every time you relaunch the program, it will reload those color palettes and basically run through this function again to get all of them generated. Alright guys, well that's going to do it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed, and of course if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments down below. Be sure to check out all of the code on GitHub, all of the links in the description to the CEP libraries, as well as references to other videos which should help you understand these better. And of course hit the like button if you enjoyed, and the subscribe button if you want to be notified of when new videos come out. And thanks again for watching this first tutorial of this kind on my channel, how to make a simple extension and we'll see you guys next time.